drivers, age, gender, and race, you stop looking at averages and you uncover a staggering reality for one specific group of people. We've talked about the overall ED average of 54.4%. But the researchers created a specific graph plotting the data across the lifespan of four distinct groups.
Right. Non-Hispanic black females, non-Hispanic black males, non-Hispanic white females, and non-Hispanic white males.
And the data line representing non-Hispanic black females doesn't just sit above the others. It exists in an entirely different stratosphere.
It really is the most alarming finding of the paper.
Walk us through it.
Let's trace the seroprevalence for non-Hispanic black females as they age. In the very youngest age bracket, spanning 18 to 24 years old, the prevalence is already sitting at 41.3%.
Let's pause and digest that. Before they even reach their 25th birthday, over 40% of the young black women walking into that emergency department are already carrying a lifelong incurable virus.
It's incredibly high.
That starting line is already double the total national average across all ages, and they're literally just entering adulthood.
The early acquisition rate is incredibly aggressive, and the curve climbs sharply from there.
What happens next?
As this demographic moves into the 25 to 34 age bracket, the prevalence surges past 70%.
70%.
And then, for non-Hispanic black females aged 35 and older, the prevalence completely plateaus at an astonishing 82.8%.
82.8%.
Yeah.
I want you to truly visualize the waiting room with that statistic in mind. If you randomly select 10 non-Hispanic black women over the age of 35 sitting in those plastic chairs waiting to be seen for a cough or a sprain, mathematically, 8 of them have the genital herpes virus permanently residing in their nervous system.
8 out of 10.
8 out of 10.
It represents a profound, overwhelming burden of infection within a highly specific community.
It's hard to even comprehend that density of infection.
And to really understand the magnitude of that 82.8% disparity, we have to look at the other lines on the graph. We have to compare them to their peers in the exact same waiting room.
Okay, let's look at the non-Hispanic black males. They are drawing from the same geographical area, dealing with the same systemic economic pressures. What does their curve look like?
The shape of the curve for non-Hispanic black males follows a similar upward trajectory with age, but the absolute numbers are dramatically lower.
How much lower?
Across every single age group, the prevalence for black men was at least 20 percentage points lower than for black women. For black men aged 35 and older, the curve plateaus at 61.4%.
I mean, 61.4% is still a massive epidemic compared to the national average.
Absolutely.
But a 20-point gap between men and women of the same race in the same neighborhood is huge. What drives that specific gender gap?
That gap is largely driven by biology and anatomy.
The physical structure.
Yes. The physiological structure of the female genital tract features a much larger surface area of vulnerable mucosal tissue compared to male anatomy.
Okay, I see.
During sexual exposure, women are biologically much more susceptible to acquiring infectious agents, including HSV2 and HIV, than men are. The virus simply has a larger, more hospitable physical target.
But the biological difference between men and women doesn't explain the most jarring comparison in the study.
No, it doesn't.
Walk us through the data for the non-Hispanic white females sitting in that exact same ED.
The curve for non-Hispanic white females tells a fundamentally different epidemiological story.
What does their line look like?
Their prevalence starts much lower and increases gradually, hitting its maximum peak of 49.3% in the 35 to 44 age bracket.
Okay, so the peak for white women is essentially half the size of the plateau for black women.
Right.
But it's what happens after that peak that completely threw me when I first read this. What happens to the white female cohort after age 44?
After hitting that 49.3% peak, the seroprevalence for non-Hispanic white females significantly decreases.
It goes down.
It drops down to 35.2% for those 45 and older. And we see the exact same phenomenon in the non-Hispanic white male cohort. They peak at 33.7% in middle age, and then significantly drop to 20.9% in the older brackets.
Okay, I have to stop and figure this out because mathematically it makes zero sense on the surface.
It definitely seems contradictory at first.
Because HSV2 is a chronic, lifelong infection. You do not clear it. You cannot cure it with antibiotics. Once it is in your dorsal root ganglion, it is there until the day you die.
That is entirely correct.
So if you were tracking a population, the prevalence of an incurable disease can only ever go up as the population ages and accumulates more exposures. It is biologically impossible for a lifelong infection to just decrease as people get older.
Right.
How can the line on the graph literally go down for older white populations?
It is a brilliant question, and answering it requires us to fundamentally understand how epidemiological studies are constructed.
Okay, lay it on me.
The key is understanding the difference between incidence and prevalence, and recognizing that this is a cross-sectional study, not a longitudinal one.
Okay, unpack those mechanics for us. What is the difference between incidence and prevalence in this context?
Think of it like a car trip. Incidence is the speed of the car. It is the rate of new infections happening in a specific time frame.
Got it. Speed is incidence.
Right. Prevalence is the total distance traveled. It is the total number of existing accumulated infections in the population.
Okay, distance is prevalence.
Now, generally speaking, the incidence of sexually transmitted infections peaks when people are in their late teens and 20s. People have more sexual partners, higher behavioral risks.
Right.
As people enter their mid-30s, they generally tend to form long-term monogamous relationships. The incidence, the rate of new infections, drops dramatically. But because HSV2 is incurable, the prevalence, the total number of people carrying it, stays high.
Right. If you get it at 22, you still count towards the prevalence at 52, even if your incidence risk is now practically zero. But that still doesn't explain why the line goes down for the older white patients.
That is where the cross-sectional nature of the study comes in. The researchers in 2007 were not following the exact same group of women from age 20 to age 60.
Oh.
They took a single snapshot of the waiting room in 2007.
A single snapshot in time.
Yes. The 25-year-old white woman giving blood in 2007 is a completely different human being than the 65-year-old white woman giving blood on the exact same day.
Oh. You were looking at different generations side by side.
Precisely. It's not a timeline of one person's life. It's a generational comparison.
That completely flips my understanding of the graph.
The older generation of white patients, the 65-year-olds walking into the ED in 2007, grew up in a completely different era, spanning the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah.
Their baseline risk profile, their behavioral norms, and the baseline prevalence of the virus in their specific dating pool during their 20s was fundamentally lower than what the 35-year-old white cohort experienced during their youth in the 1990s.
So the 65-year-old white women simply did not acquire the virus at the same aggressive rates when they were young.
Exactly. The line goes down because you are looking at a statistically safer generation.
The 35-year-old white cohort has a higher prevalence today than the 65-year-old white cohort ever did.
Exactly.
That makes complete sense. But here is the truly devastating realization when you apply that logic back to the black female cohort.
It's grim.
For non-Hispanic black females, there is no generational decrease. The line doesn't drop. It hits 82.8% at age 35, and it stays perfectly flat at that astronomical height for every single age bracket after that.
Yes, it just plateaus.
The 45-year-olds, the 55-year-olds, the 65-year-olds in 2007, they are all hovering above 80%.
The implications of that flat line are profoundly tragic.
Right.
It means that for inner-city black women, the extreme risk of acquiring this virus is not a recent phenomenon. It is not a sudden spike caused by modern behaviors.
Right, because if it was recent, the older generations would have a lower rate.
Exactly. It has been a persistent, unyielding, multi-generational reality. The 65-year-old black women in 2007 faced the exact same overwhelming exposure risks during their youths as the 35-year-old black women did.
The disparity isn't a fluke. It highlights a severe compounding of socioeconomic disadvantage, an entrenched lack of access to preventative care, and a historical public health neglect directed specifically at inner-city black women that spans literal decades.
Yes.
The system has been failing them at a constant 80% rate for half a century.
It really has. And we have to address the so what of this data. Because a skeptical listener might look at this and say, okay, the disparity is terrible. But you just spent 10 minutes explaining that 87.4% of people with this virus have absolutely no symptoms. Right. If the vast majority of these women feel perfectly fine and have no visible ulcers, is an 82.8% prevalence really a crisis? Why should we care if a harmless virus is sitting dormant in their nerves?
But the paper is extremely explicit that this virus is not harmless.
Not at all.
It casts a dark, lethal shadow over the entire community. This isn't just about the psychological stigma or the occasional physical discomfort of a blister. The presence of HSV2 biologically alters your vulnerability to much worse things.
Yes, it drastically alters it. The study explicitly points to observational data demonstrating that prevalent HSV2 infection is associated with a threefold increase in the acquisition of HIV.
A threefold increase.
3 times the risk.
If you have the herpes antibody in your blood, you are 3 times more likely to contract the human immunodeficiency virus if you are exposed to it.
It's a massive multiplier.
Let's dive into the physical mechanism of that, because it's not magic. It's a very specific biological chain reaction.
It is.
My first guess is that the herpes ulcers simply act as open wounds. It's a break in the skin, giving the HIV virus a direct, unarmored doorway straight into the bloodstream.
The physical breakdown of the mucosal barrier is certainly a major part of the equation. Even subclinical microulcerations, the tiny lesions a person doesn't even know they have, provide direct portals of entry.
Okay.
But the more insidious mechanism is actually immunological.
Immunological. How does HSV2 weaponize the immune system against the host?
Whenever there is an HSV2 reactivation on the mucosal tissue, even a subclinical one, it causes localized inflammation.
Right. Swelling, blood flow.
And inflammation is essentially the body's alarm bell and sends a chemical signal calling the immune system's heavy infantry to the surface of the skin to fight the herpes virus.
Makes sense. The body sends the troops.
Specifically, it calls a massive concentration of CD4 T cells and macrophages right to the mucosal lining.
Wait, but CD4 T cells are the exact specific type of white blood cell that HIV specifically targets, infects, and destroys to replicate itself.
Precise. Oh my God. By causing constant low-level inflammation, the HSV2 virus is effectively acting like a Trojan horse. It is calling the exact cellular victims that HIV is hunting and concentrating them in massive numbers right at the physical point of sexual contact.
It is rolling out a biological red carpet for HIV to establish a systemic infection.
That is exactly what it is doing.
When you realize the biological mechanism at play, the 82.8% statistic becomes terrifying.
It really does.
Over 80% of the Black women over 35 in this waiting room have an immune system that is constantly drawing vulnerable CD4 cells to the surface. It is a massive overlapping vulnerability for a catastrophic secondary epidemic.
And the paper mentions another severe consequence that doesn't involve HIV at all regarding pregnancy.
Perinatal transmission?
Yes. The study notes that a mother actively shedding HSV2 during childbirth can pass the virus directly to the fetus as it moves through the birth canal. While this transmission is relatively rare, when it does occur, the results are absolutely devastating. Neonatal herpes can lead to severe central nervous system damage, multi-organ failure, and it is frequently fatal to the infant.
So the overwhelming prevalence of this virus in women of childbearing age elevates this from a sexually transmitted issue to a critical pediatric and maternal health crisis.
Completely.
So we have built a complete picture of the reality hiding in the emergency department. We have an unselected urban population with a staggering 54.4% baseline prevalence. We have an incredibly vulnerable demographic of Black women carrying an 82.8% burden spanning generations.
Right.
And we know this virus biologically multiplies the risk of HIV by 300%. The ultimate question the researchers are forcing us to ask is, how does this data force us to rewrite the public health playbook?
Because whatever the current system is doing, it is catastrophically failing this specific demographic.
So to understand how to rewrite the playbook, we first have to understand the rules currently governing it.
Right. The public health strategy for screening in America is largely defined by massive national guidelines. And the researchers bring up a major philosophical and medical tension surrounding the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, or USPSTF.
The USPSTF. That's the governing body that reviews the medical evidence and essentially writes the rules on what preventative screenings doctors should offer and what insurance companies are required to cover, right?
Exactly. They are the reason you get a mammogram at a certain age or colonoscopy.
Okay, so what is their stance on this virus?
Currently, the USPSTF strongly recommends against routine serologic screening for HSV2 in the general asymptomatic population.
Against it.
Yes. They actively tell doctors not to run the ELISA blood test unless the patient is presenting with